Hello everyone and welcome to another video. This video is going to talk about the particulars of Guild Wars 2's dungeon system and how it sort of evolved from what it was back in Guild Wars 1 to what it was like at launch and what it's going to be like after the April patch. So let's just talk about a little bit about the dungeons in Guild Wars 2. The actual number of dungeons is limited. You have a few in a particular area, although there are the dungeons to do with the fractals of the mists. And the fractals of the mist is slightly different to the main dungeons throughout the Guild Wars, throughout Tyria in Guild Wars 2. And in each dungeon you have a story instance which you must complete, or one person in your party must have completed before they go on to take part in the explorable versions, which are 3 different paths through the dungeon. So there are 4 paths in total, and the explorable versions of the path, the rewards are that you receive an amount of gold, you receive some tokens that you are able to buy special weapons, special armor, and items to do with legendaries through specific vendors that are located or were located in Lion's Arch, but are located currently around the Vigil Keep. So that's the rewards for the dungeons. They don't tend to take that long to do. The dungeons have been done speedruns. I mean, the main one that was a speedrun initially was actually Ascalon Catacombs. That then became Cathedral of Flame. Now I see a lot of people doing the Dredge, the dungeon there. So yeah, there are a number of different dungeons that people are doing. And at the moment, what is the incentive for going to do dungeons? Well, you can actually earn 1 gold in a relatively short amount of time. And the Guild ArenaNet, what they decided to do to prevent the actual farming of the dungeons, initially you could redo the same dungeons over and over and over again. It was always Cathedral of Flame Path 1, and that would get you, gold and tokens. If you saved up, you can exchange them for exotic armor. You could toss that into the Mystic's Forge, or you could salvage them for Ectos, which is what I tended to do at the beginning. Buy a rare weapon, salvage, and you can make 30 silver very, very easily from 1 piece of armor. So that was what some of the benefits to doing the dungeon runs. It has slightly changed. You are limited how many times, there is diminishing returns if you do the same dungeon over and over again. It's a very good system because that allows you and gives you an incentive to go and try some of the other dungeons, particularly the ones that tend not to get done are Twilight Arbor. Corticus Manor, it's a bit hit and miss. I actually enjoy Corticus Manor. In fact, I enjoy most of the dungeons. Twilight Arbor probably the least of my favourites out of the dungeons. But the level of difficulty for each one is relatively straightforward. Maybe Twilight Arbor is a little bit difficult, but I mean, even if the Honour of the Waves, that's not very difficult at all to do, and neither is the Crucible of Eternity. Everybody does dungeon runs on these ones. Twilight Arbor, not as much. And then you get to Arah, the main dungeon. Each dungeon run is a substantial amount of time. I mean, if you compare it to Guild Wars 1 with the dungeons that we had from the dungeon book, and there were some very, very long dungeons in that, and it doesn't seem to be of the same depth as what you receive in Guild Wars 2. And what I mean is that if you were going to do a dungeon in Guild Wars 1, if you didn't have a runner, someone who could run the dungeon for you, I mean, even if you did, I mean, there were multiple levels in each dungeon. Each dungeon level was an instance, and there were normally in the harder levels there was 3 dungeon levels, and it was an extreme amount of effort. I mean, the very, very northern dungeon I think had 4 levels, just off the top of my head, but it was. I felt a greater sense of satisfaction once I completed that dungeon than I do from from Guild Wars 2. But that's just my opinion. I mean, I don't really enjoy the running of dungeons, because you're just doing the same old, dungeons over and over and over again. But doing it once a day, you know, it's okay. I mean, I always do. You'll see in the background at the moment there's Ascalon Catacombs. This is path 1, which is relatively straightforward, and path 3. Relatively few people do path 2 because it takes a significant amount of time longer than the other 2 dungeons. And the same way you can do Cathedral of Flame, you know, Ascalon, Caudicus's Manor, and Honor of the Waves. And there have been a few issues where initially they changed some of the bosses in each dungeon because it was a little bit tricky, or it was very, very easy to farm. Ascalon Catacombs' boss system got quite overhauled, and then everybody moved to a different dungeon, and they moved to the Cathedral of Flame and the Honor of the Waves, and there were certain ways to not get hit. And you'll see in the background in Ascalon Catacombs, none of this is a secret. This is just, everybody knows these are what happens in the dungeons, and this is just the standard way of running through a dungeon. So my group, we're not a particularly pro group. I mean, we are, you know, very, very good players. Well, I say very good, that's a bit of a little bit of an ego there. I'd say we're very decent players. You know, we all know, we've been playing the game a substantial amount of time. We all know what to do, and you know, we've been around, so we know how the game works. But yeah, dungeons initially were designed to be the end game, and one of my other videos talked about this, and they're not really the end game. They are a means to getting gold. I don't see another reason for why you'd go to a dungeon to do some of the explorable modes. I'd be interested to see, anybody who watches this, when was the last time they actually did a story mode of a dungeon? Not on an alt. Well, I mean, that'd probably be the only reason to do it, but if rather than the dailies, I have not done a story mode dungeon in approximately 6 months. Really, there's no need. The only reason I did a story mode was to get it on my Berserker, on my Zerka warrior, in Cathedral of the Cathedral of Flame, just because it'd be easy for someone for me to open it up, and that's the only reason I did it. But there's very little incentive to do story mode. I mean, the only reward you get is a rare headpiece. That's it. But if we look at, I'm going to bring up on screen now a list of all, just some locations of the maps, the map of where they all are. I mean, the first one I've just brought up is Caudicus Manor. It's an interesting dungeon. The paths are relatively straightforward, and you get some decent armor out of it. That's what I have on my Thief for World versus World. You've then got Ascalon Catacombs, again that's in Ascalon, and that's one of the more enjoyable dungeons to play. It's very, very straightforward. They don't tend to take that amount of time to complete past 1 and 3. And I mean, you look around the world, there are dungeons scattered all over the place. And if we go back down here and to Sorrow's Embrace, it initially was a very limited dungeon. Not many people did that in Dredgehawk Cliffs, but it's got more and more people are doing it because it's actually improved. It's got a lot quicker, and people know how to do it. It's the same with Honor of the Waves. It's one of the rarely completed dungeons these days because it was much more ran earlier. But yeah, it's much more improved, and people enjoy it, tend to run it because it's a very easy dungeon. Twilight Arbor, sorry. They removed one of the paths to create the Aetherblade path, and I very rarely run that dungeon. Very rarely people ask for it in group. And Crucible of Eternity, and obviously you can see down there that I'm bringing up some of the points of interest. You know, the Modromoth, that's where the first hint of Modromoth came from, the Crucible of Eternity, and that is a very, very popular dungeon to do. You used to be able to do 3 paths in one run through a little bug fix in Mesmer. And obviously the Citadel of Flame, annoyingly, very regularly gets contested, but it is a very simple dungeon to do. Well, particularly the path 1 and path 2. Path 3 very much more difficult. So you got the several dungeons, and dotted around the map. There's 7 in the main area of Tyria, and then you have the 8th dungeon being Arar. And believe me, they are substantially long paths, particularly Path 4. I mean, I did that in 2.5 hours. That was a pug group. It wasn't a run, it was just a pug group. We were like, okay, I fancy doing it, let's just go and do a RA. And, you know, I used some consumables, and I actually enjoyed it. You know, I didn't really learn, you know, it was very new at the time, and, you know, going through it, because I was going for Bifrost, I needed the dungeon tokens, and, you know, that was an enjoyable experience, but I wouldn't do it again, but just because the rewards aren't great enough. Then you do have the Fractal of the Mist. This was designed to supplement the dungeons that they had, and they've increased the amount of the fractals there are, but it's still not fantastic a volume of dungeons. You compare it again to Guild Wars 1, they had 18 separate dungeons, all with its own mechanics, all very long dungeons in particular, and I just don't get why Guild Wars 2 hasn't been able to achieve the same sort of standard as Guild Wars 1 in regards to the dungeons. Come launch, Guild Wars 2 stated that the dungeons were supposed to be for the end game. Well, okay, not in so many words, but it was explicitly said that, you know, there would be dungeons in Guild Wars 2, and the perception was, okay, these are going to be what's done at the end of the game. And I mean, the problem is that as you go up, as you level up, you get access to these dungeons. Now, I have to confess, when I first, you know, was leveling up, I got access to the dungeon, and I was a little bit hesitant. I just said, look, I want to play the game first, finish my living story, and then I'll go back and do the dungeons. It actually worked out a lot better for me. I know a lot of people that, when it first came out, they were like, oh, dungeons available, let's go and play it. We're level 35, let's go and play Ascalon Catacombs. Oh, that was a lot harder than people expected, you know. Path 1 now can take less than 10 minutes. In those days, at the beginning of the game, when it was launched, you're talking an hour and a half for Path 1. And yeah, so the game has evolved and it has changed, and I think they should put the dungeons at level 80. Just have it a flat level 80 start. I don't see the point in going in. I don't think any group would really accept and lower than the level 80 person into these dungeons. But yeah, I believe that Guild Wars 2 definitely needs to add in a couple more dungeons. Hopefully, perhaps if we get some new maps come with the Modromorph update, and, you know, moving out into Maguma Jungle, perhaps we'll uncover some new dungeons. But yeah, that's just my perception on the Guild Wars 2 dungeons. It'd be interesting to hear what you guys, you know, think about the Guild Wars 2 dungeons.